Welcome back to another episode. And tonight we're going to start breaking some new ground. We're going to, I guess you could say, begin plowing in to a new field, which is going to be the Foucault-Habermas debate. Most of the texts that I plan on looking at are going to be found in a single volume called Critique and Power, which is edited by Michael Kelly. And it's a book that contains a selection of articles by Habermas and some of the later works of Foucault and some of his lectures. One of those later works is the text of What is Enlightenment, which is Foucault's take on Kant's essay, What is Enlightenment? And it's a little bit more than just a take. It's, in fact, the beginning of a new vision for how to approach philosophy. And maybe you could think of it as his response to some of the problems that his critics raised, among them being Jürgen Habermas. There's definitely a lot that can be said about what Habermas wrote about Foucault and the different ways that Foucault tried to overcome the concerns that his critics raised. But I guess if we start at the history of their actual interaction, an interesting point that the editor Kelly raises in his introduction is that when an attempt was made to try to get Foucault and Habermas to participate in a debate personally together, the two of them were actually unsure, despite the different criticisms that Habermas had raised in different articles that he wrote, exactly what their differences amounted to. And this is in part due to the essay, What is Enlightenment, that Foucault wrote, because in that essay, it appears that Foucault does in fact have a way of embracing modernity. And that is a question, exactly what that amounts to is a question that will need to be explored a little bit. But the questions that Habermas raised, what can be said or what can be taken to be the substance of the debate that people have taken to have arisen through the different things that Habermas wrote about Foucault, mainly, I think could be reduced to one issue, one core issue, which is the issue of relativism. And this is probably the single issue where you could find them most in stark contrast to one another. Although perhaps it is a matter of interpretation. But Foucault, when he wrote the book, The Order of Things, the French title is Les mots et les choses, Words and Things, was taken to have been doing a historical project that was, on the one hand, genealogical, meaning he was trying to go back to different moments in history and show what historical forces led up to them and produced them in a causal sort of way. And oftentimes what Foucault does, as he's exploring those forces of history in a genealogical way, is he tries to find events that have been marginalized in typical historical writing that make it often appear that the different events that he's interested in history have come about in a way that's kind of haphazard or contingent. So there is a little bit of tension that's embedded in his way of doing genealogy. And I guess what I need to do is give you a little more substance so far as what it is that he's looking for to try to explain on the one hand in terms of historical forces, and on the other hand, try to emphasize their contingent nature. And what he's interested in are discursive formations. So I said that there were two ways that he tries to do history. One of them was genealogical, the other was archaeological. And the archaeological side is where that real discussion of discursive formations really comes in. So the discursive formations that he has in mind are these bodies of knowledge that are constituted by members of society, and the way that knowledge and society itself, the people who make use of that knowledge in one way or another, or put it into practice in some way or fashion, become implicated in a way of life, so that you have this linguistic aspect that amounts to a way of organizing a way of life. And this is going back to ideas that come from Ferdinand de Saussure, who discussed language as a system of concepts. So to just put this whole picture together, you have this genealogical approach that tries to discover how these discursive formations come into being, how knowledge gets organized, and how it becomes a framework for patterning the way that a society operates, or different parts of society operate, like hospitals or prisons or insane asylums or schools. And he looks at those discursive formations, those formations of knowledge, power, practice, use of those systematic formations in an archaeological way. So he sees them as different strata, just to fill in exactly what the image that it seems like he wants you to have in mind is, just in the same way as when you're looking at a rock face, you can see different moments of time by looking at different layers of rock. So he is uncovering different strata of these discursive formations, these formations of knowledge that are organizing social structures, and looking at them. Perhaps the best way to understand the project as a whole is to just go back to Saussure's idea once more of a diachronic way of looking at language, that is, the way that it has changed through history, along with a synchronic way of looking at language, which would be the way that language has taken up a certain form at different moments in time, at different moments in history. So the genealogical aspect would be the diachronic aspect. So that's the way that language is changing through time. That's the way that society is changing through time. That's the way that different ways of knowing and different ways of putting that knowledge into practice have come into being. And the geological strata, the archaeological side of it, would be looking at those discursive formations as existing in a more horizontal framework, if you will. So isolating them from the ongoing process of historical development, but at the same time seeing them as a product of history. So it's kind of a complex thing to try to discuss, but I think the synchronic diachronic distinction does give you something to hold on to. And once you start reading Foucault's works, Birth of the Clinic, Discipline and Punish, The Order of Things, it falls together rather neatly. But as I was saying, probably the question that most interpreters, most readers of Foucault and Habermas would see as being the dividing line between the two is that Foucault's discussion, especially in the order of things, makes it appear that these different strata, these different historical layers of the ways that society organizes itself around different types of knowledge, come about through unexpected sets of events, so that there's nothing necessary about the way that one formation of society and the knowledge regime, I guess you could say, begins to take shape after another. So it begins to challenge the idea throughout history. Our progress in knowledge has just been something like a consistent upward climb up a slope to higher and higher realizations and to better and better ways of knowing the world. It kind of challenges that idea in a sense by making it look as though each different type of knowledge, which might be more adequate in some ways, more convincing in some ways, have better ways of justifying itself and legitimating itself, is nevertheless something that came about in ways that were not itself entirely necessary. So, a correlate to Foucault would be somebody like Thomas Kuhn in his idea that there are certain paradigms that emerge and different revolutions that the progress of science has gone through, but that progress itself is not one that is not without its own internal problems, and there are forces behind the way that these structures of knowledge, these knowledge regimes, begin to come together that don't necessarily have anything to do with whether one argument is better than another. Sometimes it has more to do with political factors, so to speak, and the reason why some types of knowledge get suppressed has a lot to do with those same kinds of factors. It has to do with things like power and influence. Okay, so Habermas is going to be somebody who objects strongly to that idea, because one of his core ideas is that the Enlightenment as an ethos, or I should say, the Enlightenment is an ethos that he believes in. In his books and articles, Habermas discusses the idea of social norms quite a bit. And it seems like what he's doing is taking a very pragmatic approach to what knowledge amounts to within a particular social order. And what he wants to do is to say, well, there's a certain extent to which knowledge fits within a certain society the way it does, because it works, because it fulfills certain needs of that society. It fulfills certain ends, and beyond that pragmatic approach, this knowledge is useful for that, and so on and so forth. Beyond that approach, you have an attempt to try to discover something more ultimate, discover some kind of knowledge within that framework. And as we go through history, we make more and more progress toward discovering knowledge with a capital K, as opposed to just finding knowledge with a lowercase k. We come closer and closer to some kind of real truth about the way things are, which is exactly the sort of thing that somebody like Foucault or Thomas Kuhn might want to, put the brakes on a little bit. So this is kind of what the debate comes down to. It's kind of what readers of Foucault and Habermas have sometimes thought the debate comes down to. And Foucault has here and there in his books and articles tried to respond to the claim that what his books really amount to is just propagating a form of relativism. That as these discursive formations arise in history, that they're not necessarily going in any particular direction. What they're actually doing is serving the interests of a particular class. What they actually are just expressions of a will to power that manifests itself through history. So the other aspect to this debate over relativism is how to approach doing history in the first place. And an objection that gets raised against Foucault by his commentators is, whether Foucault actually recognizes that his own historical takes on different events in history, different periods of history, whether he realizes that his own writing is just as subject to the influences of his own time period, to the influences of the different ways that power is shaping him, his life, his attitudes, the way in which those influences are shaping the way that he views history. That, if he's aware that his own argument implies that his own take on history is just another series of steps, and none of which can be taken to be truly foundational. If we're looking for some kind of real knowledge, that's not biased in some way, that's not contaminated in some way by these different points of view that people have in history, does Foucault recognize that his own take on history cannot get outside of that problem, that there is no way to achieve some kind of objective perspective and discover the truth about history by uncovering the different historical forces that led to the formations of power that he finds existing in them. Foucault's project, as he sees it, is really to do his genealogical work to try to reveal these different discursive formations. I'm using that word just to refer to a way of organizing society around a certain idea of knowledge. But what his genealogical approach is really all about is unmasking the nature of those formations as having some kind of objective claim to knowing in a certain way, and unmasking them as power formations, as formations that were created in the interest of power. So that is Foucault's way of kind of liberating our own perspective. As we come into our own time period, we can see the forces that have shaped us as really just different discursive moments that have their own internal structure behind them, but whose structure has been shaped by historical forces that really amount to a kind of search for ways to overcome nature, attain a certain way of gaining more efficiency in society, I'm thinking about sections of Discipline and Punish, where he's thinking about how schools begin to be run like military barracks, which were in turn modeled on monastic ways of ordering people's lives, so that there's a progression there into more and more efficiency, and that efficiency is itself tied into a more instrumental approach to reason, which fits into the growing way forward in Western culture as we move toward a more and more technologically based society, moving into the Industrial Revolution. So, without any further preamble, I'm going to just say what I have in mind as far as these texts and what I'd like to say about them. The first one is the first section of Words and Things, the Order of Things, as it's called in the English translation. And the opening section there, where he discusses the painting called Las Meninas, and following that, discussing the main themes of his essay, What is Enlightenment? So what I'm going to do first, what I'm going to try this time, is just going over what I have found in the text, in both of these texts, and then coming back to give some commentary. So we could divide this into two parts. We'll call the first part text, and the second part commentary. So this is part one, where I'm just going to discuss what's in these texts. So the first one, Las Meninas, I think you could think of it as a kind of metaphor for Foucault's entire project, this entire project of uncovering knowledge as a historically shaped phenomenon, and the relation that it has to power, and the way in which knowledge shapes society and is in turn shaped by society. So to dig into this text, what he really does for most of the very first chapter is describe what's going on in a painting, which, if you have the English translation in paperback, actually appears on the cover of the book. So I'm just going to describe, what he describes in the first few pages. So what you see in the painting is a painter with a very large easel. And what you see is just the back of the easel. This easel looks like it's about 10 feet tall. It's a very, very tall room. And the painter is just looking over to one side of this easel. And he's looking directly at you, the spectator, the person who's viewing the painting. So we're looking at the painting. The painter is looking directly at us with the canvas in front of him, and all we can see is the back. So we just see the back of the easel, the wooden frame. So we don't get to see what he's painting. And then the rest of the painting is taken up on the right-hand side with some small children and a dog who look like they might potentially be subjects for the painting. And we ourselves are now being painted, and perhaps after we're finished, they're going to take their turn. An interesting detail is that toward the center, and it's not really in dead center of the painting, but off to the left a little bit, there's a mirror, and you see two people staring back at you. And the suggestion here is that the mirror is a mirror of us, the people who are looking at the painting. So there's a kind of reflexivity implied in this painting. Okay, and then another detail is that there is someone opening a door in the very back area of the room, who looks like he's maybe the patron of the painter, looking in at the whole scene. So that's the scenery in the painting. Here's a quote to just fill that out a little bit with what Foucault has to say. So he says on page 4, "In appearance, this locus is a simple one, a matter of pure reciprocity. We are looking at a picture in which the painter is in turn looking out at us. A mere confrontation, eyes catching one another's glance, direct looks superimposing themselves upon one another as they cross. And yet this slender line of reciprocal visibility embraces a whole complex network of uncertainties, exchanges, and feints. The painter is turning his eyes toward us only insofar as we happen to occupy the same position as his subject. We, the spectators, are an additional factor. Though greeted by that gaze, we are also dismissed by it, replaced by that which was always there before we were, the model itself. But inversely, the painter's gaze, addressed to the void confronting him outside the picture, accepts as many models as there are spectators. In this precise but neutral place, the observer and the observed take part in a ceaseless exchange. No gaze is stable, or rather, in the neutral furrow of the gaze piercing at a right angle through the canvas, the subject and object, the spectator and the model, reverse their roles to infinity. So that is the text that I want to have as a foundation for further commentary later on. And I think the important point to keep in mind for now is just the dynamics of the painter's gaze, our looking at the painter, and the fact that we can't see what's on the canvas, and also the fact that there are other potential models in the painting, which suggests that the painter could potentially be painting any one of these models, including ourselves and the people who are now sitting for the painter. So something maybe to clarify is that because we can see the two people in the mirror who are the actual subjects of the painting that he's painting on the canvas, that tells us that it's not we ourselves who are the ones being painted on the canvas, but we are the spectators. Okay? And you could kind of take the painter himself as another spectator, given the fact that any of these other people in the painting could potentially be a subject for his canvas. So there is a kind of structure to the way the painting is set up, different layers to the, I guess you could say, the kind of doubling that's going on within the painting. But what acts as kind of a middle ground between these sets of doubles, spectators, painter, subjects of the painting, the painter, what lies in between them is the canvas, which is where the work of representing is going on. So without going into my commentary, I'm just going to say that I think what's important about this is that it has a way of answering some of these concerns about relativism and history. I think there is a way in which Foucault is telling us what his project is fundamentally about through this metaphor. So just putting that on pause for a moment, we're going to go into his What is Enlightenment text. And some of the most important points here are just what, first of all, he's making of Kant's project. Now, the important point that he brings up is that Kant brings up what amounts to kind of a reversal in the way that we normally think about ourselves as free within a free society. And what he's advocating for is a complete freedom in the public use of our reason. And in our private life, by contrast, a kind of subservience to our daily duties, to the tasks that we have to accomplish while we're at work, the duties that we have to our family and friends, and to the government as citizens of a society, of a political order. That's a reversal of the normal way that we think, the way that we usually think about ourselves. Because if you go back to Descartes, the way in which I'm free is as a thinking subject. So my freedom is located in my interior world. That is the place where I am free most of all. Even if I'm locked in a prison somewhere, I'm still free with respect to my own freedom of thought. But for Kant, the reversal is to make the public use of one's freedom the locus of our freedom and liberty. Whereas in our private lives, he thinks that is the place where we should be doing our duty as good citizens. Okay. Now, in the second part of the essay, Foucault begins discussing Baudelaire. Now, it might seem that somebody like Kant and Baudelaire don't have very much to do with one another. Baudelaire is an artist. He's taken to be someone who's more part of the romantic anti-Enlightenment that grew up after Kant was gone, after Kant left the stage, in reaction to the Enlightenment. But nevertheless, Foucault sees a way to find a continuity between the vision of modernity that's founded in the Kantian sense of freedom, and what Baudelaire sees as emblematic of modernity. And I think Foucault does a good job of bringing that out in one or two of the quotes that he supplies from Baudelaire. So here he is describing the man of modernity, okay? And this is Baudelaire. Quote, "Away he goes, hurrying, searching. Be very sure that this man, ellipsis, this solitary gifted with imagination, ceaselessly journeying across the great human desert, has an aim loftier than that of a mere flaneur." That's a kind of lazy layabout, someone without much ambition. Has a far loftier aim than that of a mere flaneur. An aim more general, something other than the fugitive pleasure of circumstance. He is looking for that quality which you must allow me to call modernity. Okay, and there's another ellipsis. He makes it his business to extract from fashion whatever element it may contain of poetry within history. Unquote. Foucault goes on, as an example of modernity, Baudelaire cites the artist Constantin Guise. In appearance, a spectator, a collector of curiosities, he remains, quote, the last to linger wherever there could be a glow of light, an echo of poetry, a quiver of life, or a chord of music. Wherever a passion can pose before him, wherever natural man and conventional man display themselves in a strange beauty, wherever the sun lights up the swift joys of the depraved animal, unquote. And then down toward the end of the paragraph, we have a quote that kind of brings together what Kant is trying to do. So Foucault says, or rather I should say what Foucault is trying to do. So Baudelairean modernity is an exercise in which extreme attention to what is real is confronted with the practice of a liberty that simultaneously respects this reality and violates it. So how do you bring this all together? Well, when Foucault brings up the liberty, the kind of liberty that this modern man has in mind, what he has in mind is actually his liberty to enter into that poetry of everyday life, to try to supersede it in some way. So Baudelaire's description of modernity is this flux of events that don't seem to have very much meaning in themselves. So this you can kind of see a parallel between that and Kant's idea that in our private lives we're doing our duty. We're doing our duty as citizens, employees, whatever our roles in society are. We're kind of going through our daily lives doing what we need to do. But in the midst of doing all those things, we discover something that transcends that flux of events. And it's through that ability to see beyond them, to transcend them, to discover, as he says, the poetry of the moment, through our ability to transcend our circumstances of our daily life, we find the foundation for a freedom to express ourselves with full liberty, provided that we live in a political environment that allows us to do that. We live in a liberal society that gives us freedom of speech. When we find things in our daily experience that take us beyond that experience, that allow us to transcend the minutiae, the particularities, the what have you, the back and forth, when we find that, we have something that we can bring to society that will liberate ourselves and potentially liberate other people. And the artist does that as part of his mission. That is the mission of the artist, most of all, is to try to transcend and liberate. But we, as average individuals, don't necessarily have to be actual artists to do this. We can make our lives into a kind of work of art. And this is a major theme of Foucault's later years. The idea that we can make our life into a work of art, that what is distinctive about modern man is his capacity to recreate himself, and even you might even say, responsibility that he has to do that toward himself and toward others in society, to transcend the particularities of his existence and to try to liberate himself by trying to see beyond the day-to-day, the back and forth, and the routine. So with that as a foundation, a textual foundation for discussion, I'm now going to move into part 2, where I'm going to give you my personal take on these texts and what I think they mean and why they're important and how they fit into the framework of this whole discussion of history and the different problems that arise with Foucault's way of doing history. So coming back to the painting, I was saying the important thing to keep in mind is the doubling that's going on there. Spectator, painter, the subjects of the painting and the painter, and the different possible subjects of the painting that might enter into the representation. But if you boil down that, or if you reduce that doubling theme down to a single, concept, it would be presentation and representation, or presentation and representation. Now, what the gaze of the painter really amounts to is the gaze of the other. And you could even take this in a Lacanian direction, that the gaze of the painter is really looking at us through the gaze of someone who is going to try to represent what we are presenting to him. There's a certain way in which it's going to be done that defines, in a certain sense, his outlook, the conditions under which he can create his art. And one of the things that Lacan says, which is kind of interesting in the context of this discussion, is Lacan sees the other as a kind of nexus for predetermining the ways in which we represent ourselves in communication, linguistically. I'm going to read a short quote here to bring this out. So this is from his essay called The Freudian Thing in a chapter called The Locus of Speech. So he says, the other is, therefore, the locus in which is constituted the I who speaks, along with the he who hears, what is said by the one being already the reply, the other deciding in hearing it whether one has spoken or not. So, to the extent that we will be recognized by the other through our speech, or let's say the extent to which we will be recognized, depends on our ability to communicate in such a way that the other can represent what we are saying, if you really want to boil it down. And the Lacanian sense is that our self-concept, our way of constituting ourselves, is in some sense constituted by that relationship. The way in which our ego is constituted as something that amounts to a public presentation of ourselves, a way of representing ourselves publicly, potentially in a public way, so that we can be understood by others, is dependent on that other person's ability to represent us in the way that we are trying to present ourselves. So there's this back and forth between the I, the ego, which is trying to constitute itself in a particular way with a linguistic framework as the background, and the other, who we see as the potential person who will be representing who we are. And that is a kind of locus of self-constitution that's going on within the ego. But in a broader sense, it's also a way in which our sense of how our world can be constituted as a whole gets worked out, because our world is, the framework of our world really is something that is brought out through speech, through language. How do we get from this to the idea of history? Well, what is history but a kind of representation? So the facts of our daily lives, the facts of history, you can put all that together within the framework of the historian as the painter, who is trying to represent the world around him or herself with all these possible different subjects available for representation on the canvas. And there's also a way in which art comes into the picture. The canvas itself can be said to be a stand-in for art, in as much as art is really fundamentally about representation, going back to an idea that comes from Plato, the idea that art is fundamentally mimesis. The word chimes with that idea of miming, which is kind of a form of imitation, of representing of something. And perhaps what you can get out of this idea is that this project of representing is something that is going to be inherently flawed, in the sense that, well, you're not going to achieve objectivity there. But that doesn't mean that you can't represent a particular kind of truth. That doesn't mean that through art we don't have access to a higher truth simply because we haven't presented the reality of something as it is. So there's a way in which we can transcend the particularities of the moment, the mere statement of the facts, and getting to something deeper than that, and perhaps something that is something important about human nature that may be of lasting significance, that gets us to a different kind of truth than the truth of, well, was this represented exactly accurately as things were or as things are in the painting? That's of less concern, or perhaps should be seen as being of less concern than the kind of truth that we can pull out of the effort that goes into the vision of the artist and their representation. So moving on now to the essay, What is Enlightenment? My comments on this are simply that, first of all, I reread it, and it's been quite a few years since I've done so, but I found it to be a very interesting, very stimulating essay, and particularly the part that involved Baudelaire. I'm actually very surprised to see him trying to put together Baudelaire as a representative of, what most people would probably think of as an anti-Enlightenment tradition, with Kant, who bookends the other side as the most Enlightenment figure of them all. And, what I think is most interesting about this essay is the way in which it's this thread of a conception about modernity that ties those two together. And the most important point, I think, as a reader of these texts to take from this is really the individual as the locus of modernity. So on the one hand, we have individuals trying to transcend their particular circumstances. They're trying to see beyond the particularities of the day-to-day events of their lives and get to something that transcends that, and that is what characterizes modernity. But the important point to take away here is who is doing the transcending. Suddenly it's individuals who are doing this. Suddenly it's a project that individuals are meant to carry out. That is really the most important point. And what does this have to say about Kant's whole project, his whole way of doing history? Well, it comes back to a way of approaching history that involves making individuals, not any particular individual, but individuals, and what happens to individuals, what happens to us as subjects of power, discipline, punishment, whatever it is that society tries to do to try to organize and make people work more efficiently, et cetera, et cetera. It's really about us as the subjects of a social order and what it's attempting to do. And so what Foucault's whole project is really all about is, instead of looking at macro forces in history and looking at heroic moments in history where major players did things that, caused history to go in one direction as opposed to another, what he's really interested in is looking at the way that the individual fits within a certain social framework. And when you apply the idea of the individual possibly being able to liberate themselves or find some sort of liberation through making life into kind of a process of self-creation, we have kind of a recipe for discovering how individuality within the framework of modernity can be seen as a way of liberating yourself through taking yourself through how society has formed the different power structures that it's formed, as a way of unmasking what they are and what they amount to. So, in that sense, the project of philosophy, if it can be turned toward that same sort of project that the individual is meant to undertake, can join hands with what individuals are trying to do to transcend their own personal circumstances. And Foucault wants to try to turn philosophy in a direction where it's most interested in that individual and uncovering and liberating individuals by unmasking the power structures within societies. So with that, I think, I've said quite a lot here about Foucault's historical project. How does all of this really respond to the problem of relativism? Well, I don't think it does so directly exactly so much as it does so indirectly suggest that to a certain extent, what critics are asking for is really something that is either impossible or may even be counterproductive. So if the critics don't want that representation to take form, if they're asking for an impossible representation or we're faithfully representing exactly the way things were, number one, we have to ask, what sort of value that sort of representation really is, whether that's really even possible. Most historians would say that it is impossible because everything is going to be perspectival to a certain extent. But also, by making this sort of demand, we are throwing away the value of the representation that comes through the artist's way of perceiving things. So that's one hand. On the other hand, to do the kind of history that Foucault wants to do by uncovering the way these power structures, discursive formations develop, we're doing a different sort of history where we are basically laying bare the structures of things, which to me is kind of a way of giving a little bit more of a sense of where the reality of these structures actually can be felt in an objective way. So I think those are my takeaways so far from this discussion, this approach to Foucault. And I don't think readers should be put off by the demand for objectivity in historical writing as a reason not to read Foucault. I think ultimately the value of what he's doing lies in what we can find in his own representations of history as he has found it, with the added weight of the fact that he's representing things in a very objective way in terms of the particularities of the way these different power structures came to exist in society. Okay, so with that, I am going to call it a night.